The Leonard Nimoy Bot's artificially intelligent question. In this first episode, Leonard Bot invites Johnny Cash Bot to ponder Art Bell's radio setup. In this first episode, Leonard Bot invites Johnny to ponder Art Bell's radio.
What would it take to recreate Art Bell's show today? I pose this question to the Johnny Cash Artificial Intelligence. Hypothetical question. What equipment would you need if you were going to do a live broadcast for AM radio the way Art Bell did it from the comfort of his own home? What equipment did he use to broadcast? How was he able to connect to the radio network satellite? And what did he use to accept callers to his show while it was on the air?
Art's gear from midnight in the desert days was as follows. Clip playback, 360 systems instant replay 2. Later changed that to a Denon DNF 400 with their CF400S controller. Phone system, a Telos IP phone system. Likely a VX Enterprise supplied by Telos. Mixer, Audio Arts 08 console. Headset. Either Audio-Technica BPH East 1 or Bear DT29MKI, likely the Bear. He'd been a fan of their gear, rack gear. Diva Broadcast DB6400, and a compressor I couldn't see well enough to name. XD is uplink model from Nexus Broadcast, and a separate computer taking the main out of the mixer and uploading it to the stream provider. I'm working on figuring out the software used, but don't expect much from the few screenshots and grainy videos of his Periscope days. Get it, Periscope. On top of all of the specific hardware, you'll need Art's charisma and patience as well. All you would need is an internet connection. The radio station would buy the feed and broadcast it on their signals. I wonder if Art's problem with the last show, even the serious show, was that he needed it to be exactly the same as it was in the 1990s. Instead of doing a recorded podcast with a Patreon like everyone else, he needed live broadcast, 3 different telephone numbers, live callers, the exact same music, Keith Rowland running the website, no producer, a double-wide trailer in the desert with a giant antenna, etc. Despite the similarities, podcasts and radio shows are not the same thing. They don't carry the same energy. He loved live shows and taking calls. Doing a pre-recorded one without live callers wouldn't have appealed to him at all. He was happy to do the show in the Philippines even with the changes that required, which included a call screener, something that he had always detested before. So he wasn't a slave to nothing changing, but a podcast isn't a radio show. Yeah, I get that. I just mean that it's too bad that a recorded podcast didn't appeal to him. He quit the serious show because it kind of sucked broadcasting a show to an audience of no one. And I imagine he quit the podcast just because it was too much work at his age. A podcast would have been easier, and in time he could have made a lot of money from it. Art was always a techie. He was always tinkering with electronics and loved his computers, of which he had several running concurrently. He also had people who had worked for him currently or previously that handled the other aspects of his show. So a podcast wouldn't have been an issue. From a technical standpoint, Art was not hurting for money. At the show's peak, he was the #1 syndicated nighttime talk show and #4 overall, which also includes all the big-name political commentary ones. People often tease him about living in a double-wide and for a long time living a Geo-Metro, but both of those were by choice. And if you ever saw how he expanded into what is often described as a compound, you would know he was not strapped for cash. That's me. He also owned an expensive RV and would take trips in it with Ramona. And let's not forget his ham radio towers. He had the largest privately owned ham antenna farm in the world. That alone probably cost millions. On top of his ham gear, which I can tell you in total, at least in the 5-digit range, Plus he built his own radio station in Pahrump, which still operates today, KNYE. Point is, making money off a format he wouldn't have liked wouldn't have mattered. The giant antenna was for ham radio, not the show. LOL. And the double-wide trailer in the desert was mostly for living in. That last point was just meant to be funny. The rest of it was serious. I claimed the issue was that his show would be streaming or repayable for truckers or something. And at the time, Sirius didn't have playback abilities or store shows. And this pissed off Art, and that was it. I seem to recall that Art wanted the Sirius show to be available to non-subscribers. The problem with the show is that once it went behind the paywall, the audience consisted almost entirely of truckers. His mic during the classic C2C days was a Heel PR30 or PR40, dynamic mics with condenser-like sound. Pretty much any mic like a Shure SM7B, EV or E20, PR30-40, it will get you that broadcast sound. I believe that was in the beginning, cause a couple years in he started doing headsets so he could sit comfortably like he's talking to a friend. I looked into it. You need pretty substantially large towers to do decent daytime AM, less so at night, but they're surprisingly cheap. Like $250,000, whole thing could be set up for $2 million. The main stumbling block is bandwidth. You essentially need to purchase an existing station or pay a radio engineer to find clear bandwidth in your geographical area. But the FCC hasn't been handing out new station licenses in a few years. Better for the big companies. Our show was syndicated for the most part, so the stations paid him to have his show on the air. It's super cool seeing all of the set feeds and automation for commercial playback come from one little box, running a whole station. Pretty sure Art explained this. His show was free to affiliates. They aired his advertising. That's how syndication works. Oh yeah, you're right, my bad. Just tried to point out that a person, as a broadcaster, doesn't need their own AM station. There's so much work as far as FCC compliance and paperwork go. Yes, there's lots of confusion on this thread. Also, OP is trying to draw attention to their own ripoff of Art, so no worries. He had his own radio tower outside his house. Since his was an AM broadcast signal, I'm pretty sure everything is digital now, where it could be broadcast over the internet to a station that has their own tower. That was for his ham radio array. The show was broadcast via a satellite uplink which required a dish or dishes. A control unit inside the equipment rack. ISDN links around them would have been common also, usually for a backup. Some engineers have told me today that it isn't uncommon for radio stations to actually broadcast it over the internet to the transmitter for local radio stations. 2 stations in the same cluster locally here, plus a non-related Hispanic broadcaster got kicked off air when a major project outside of town tore up internet lines by accident. No microwave link backup, so they went down hard until the lines got repaired. I am kind of boggled by the amount of people who see and assume his ham towers were for broadcasting his show when, 1, he talked about ham radio and those towers often, and 2, he also talked occasionally about how his entire setup worked via SN lines and satellite uplinks. Usually when a caller asked about it,